growth model, the previous growth model,
Right.
has been actually quite successful for three reasons.
Mm-hmm.
First is that unlike many of its African peers, Kenya has rejected the statist public sector driven model of development since independence.
Mm-hmm.
Kenya is one of the few countries in the region that has embraced the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, goods sold as far as Rwanda, Burundi, and of course neighboring Uganda, Tanzania, but also Eastern Congo,
Mm-hmm.
were produced in Kenya. The best private hospitals were established here, as were global accounting and auditing firms.
Right.
The second reason why Kenya's growth model has worked so well in the past is that it's been based on broad-based democracy. So formidable Kenyan intellectuals, a vibrant media
Mm-hmm.
have paved the continent in reclaiming its democratic rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good thing in the long term. And the third feature of Kenya's growth, or fact rather, is that Kenya has always managed to live within its means. And this is probably an underappreciated fact because Kenya is remarkable in the fact that it has never sought or taken debt relief.
All right. And Kenya has not sought or taken debt relief, but, we are still saying the past decade has also registered very bad results, not too bad, but we can say that Kenya has underperformed in certain industries, which are very key in creating jobs, especially the agriculture and manufacturing industries particularly. But why do you think this is so?
Right, so that takes us from the past to the present.
Mm-hmm.
And what we find in the report is even though the growth model in the past might have been appropriate, there are some features of it that don't work for the current and possibly for the present and for the future.
Mm-hmm.
And one of it is that growth has not been inclusive. So poverty is persistent, job creation, as you mentioned, is low, and informality is high.
Mm-hmm.
Now, zeroing in on the job creation aspect, there's an average of about 50,000 jobs that are undersupplied in the economy every year,
Right.
and that's growing.
Mm-hmm.
So why is that? Well, there are many reasons. You have a weak business environment. You have a lot of informality that prevents high quality, good jobs from being created.
Mm-hmm.
And we often think of agriculture and manufacturing as the job creators in the economy.
Mm-hmm.
But the jobs that are created in those sectors, we find about 90% of them are low productivity jobs.
Right.
So the question is, what is the formal sector doing then? The good news is that the formal sector is creating high value, high productivity jobs,
Mm-hmm.
namely in modern services. But the bad news is that at only about 75,000 jobs a year, those jobs are far few in between. So the question is, how do we reconcile the fact that even though the poor are in agriculture, growth has been happening elsewhere, namely in modern services.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a big puzzle that we sort of address in the report.
All right. According to the report, there are also indications that for Kenya to be able to deal with poverty, then there is need to revive the agricultural sector. But then what we're looking at very conservative methods of agriculture in the country, those that one would actually say have been tradition from, I think, days of independence, or at least from the days that Kenya actually got very active in terms of commercializing agriculture. But are there other strategies that we can put in place to ensure that the agriculture sector is revived?
Right. Now, I'm not an agriculture expert per se, but so let me take that question from an economist's perspective.
Right.
Now, there are many reasons why agriculture is stagnating.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that agriculture is still rain-fed is one. We can talk about lack of capacity and knowledge and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the big points we make in our report is that the one reason why agriculture is stagnating is because sugar and maize markets in particular remain distorted.
Right.
And they remain distorted because of low competition and the influence of the National Cereals and Produce Board, the NCPB, in determining prices. In fact, in our report, we estimate that if these market distortions were removed, just in sugar and maize markets alone, poverty rates would reduce by an additional 4 percentage points. And that's huge joy.
Yeah, that's indeed huge. And it's interesting that you mentioned sugar and maize that are some of the biggest contributors, I think, to Kenya's GDP. But then again, when you look at what is happening in these very industries, they actually happen to have the biggest cartels in the industry today. So do you think that there is something particularly wrong or maybe that we are not getting right in regard to these two sectors?
I think the answer is hidden in your question, because the moment you use the word cartel, well, that's what's wrong. As I said, these markets are not competitive because of inadequate and insufficient competition. So when I say removing distortions in the market, that's precisely what I'm talking about.
All right. Okay, let's talk about the creation of jobs. Your report does also show that Kenya has some of the highest unemployment rates, not just in Africa, but around the world. And despite the fact that we are the industrial hub on the East African platform, it still doesn't reflect in job creation for the younger people. But how do we create jobs?
So that's a billion-dollar question. How do we create jobs? Well, in broad terms, the more growth you have, the more jobs that are created. But we find that there is a disconnect between growth and job creation. And the disconnect is again because most of the poor live in rural areas and agriculture, and growth has been happening elsewhere. But that doesn't mean we need to negate growth. I mean, growth happening in other services is still a good thing, and we can talk about that later. But let's come back to the stagnating sectors and job creation. So job creation is constrained for many reasons. The high external costs of labor, for example. In our report, we point out that labor costs in Kenya are 4 times more than in comparator countries such as Bangladesh, which is at a similar level of income per capita. So if you're a formal sector employer, Joy, you would be paying 4 times more than your counterpart in Bangladesh. There's a usual suspects of the business environment, the high cost of electricity. In your previous segment, you were referring to Olkaria.
Yes.
So those are all steps in the right direction. So the trend is right in terms of the business environment, but there is still some ways to go. One quick point on the business environment. Given devolution in this country,
Yes.
what we find is that going forward, the action is really in improving the business environment at subnational levels, at county levels. And so there's a lot of catching up to do there. Last point on job creation, we often talk about environment and the education system as the usual suspects. But one of the things we also point out in the report is labor market regulations.
Yes.
So in 2007, for example, a labor code was revised, and we find that may have disincentivized formal job creation. Why? Because Kenya's minimum wages are now among the highest in its peer countries. So that is an incentive then for formal firms to become less formal, shall we say, and push them into informality, which is another aspect of non-inclusivity of Kenya's economy.
All right. Now, previously, we have talked about the fact that the discovery of oil in Kenya is more of a curse than it is a blessing for an economy like Kenya that has not had the history of actually dealing with certain resources, I might add. But from where you sit as an economist at the World Bank, do you think that Kenya to benefit much from its oil discoveries?
Right, and that takes us to the future. So in the report we ask, well, Vision 2030 targets 7% per capita GDP growth from now on until 2030.
Right.
And we give a bit of a reality check there. And we ask, well, where is all this growth going to come from given the current fiscal weaknesses and the past? And it's not easy. So we find 3 growth drivers, and I call them IOU.
Yes.
I for innovation, O for oil, and U for urbanization. Well, since you asked me about oil, let me just focus on the O.
Yes.
And here there are 3 special reasons why oil discoveries in Kenya are different. One is the location. The fact that oil has been discovered in the poorest, most marginalized county of Turkana, which is already prone to conflict.
Right.
So that's sort of not such a factor that makes Kenya special. Because of existing conflict, if expectations are not managed well, if revenue sharing is not equitable, then oil discoveries can exacerbate that existing conflict.